The crack of gunfire echoed through Rattlesnake Gulch as Vaughn Zeller's bullet shattered the bottle perched atop the fence post, sending glass fragments spiraling into the dust. His face, weathered by years under the merciless western sun, remained locked in a permanent scowl as the onlookers flinched at his display of marksmanship and temper. "Damn it all to hell!" Vaughn roared, holstering his Colt with such force that the leather creaked in protest. "Next man who says I cheated at cards better be ready to wear his guts for garters." The men gathered outside the saloon shuffled their boots nervously in the dirt, none willing to meet the fierce blue eyes glaring out from beneath the brim of Vaughn's battered hat. At 34, the cowboy's reputation for explosive anger preceded him across 3 territories. Some claimed it was the war that did it, others whispered about the family he'd lost to fever years back. Whatever the cause, one thing remained certain: nobody in their right mind crossed Vaughn Zeller. "Easy now, Vaughn," muttered Samuel, the aging bartender who'd seen enough blood spilled over foolish words. "Nobody's calling you a cheat no more." Vaughn spat into the dust. Better not. With a final glare that silenced even the wind, he stalked toward his horse, a magnificent black stallion that seemed to share its master's temperament. The year was 1875, and Willow Creek, Colorado, had grown from a mining camp to a proper settlement with a main street, a schoolhouse, and even talk of a railway connection. Yet beneath the veneer of civilization, the frontier spirit, raw, untamed, and often violent, still bubbled like spring water through limestone. Vaughn had arrived in Willow Creek 5 years ago, establishing himself as one of the most skilled ranch hands in the territory. When not working cattle for the Bar S Ranch, he kept to himself, occupying a small cabin on the outskirts of town. His only regular companion was his horse, Thunder, and occasionally the inside of a whiskey bottle. As he mounted Thunder and prepared to ride back to his cabin, a commotion near the general store caught his attention. A crowd had gathered, their voices rising in concern. "Dr. Perkins ain't in town for another week. She's burning up something fierce. What about the baby?" Vaughn's instinct was to ride in the opposite direction. Other people's troubles weren't his concern. Yet something, perhaps the mention of a baby, made him pause. He watched as a slender woman emerged from the store, clutching a small bundle to her chest. Even from a distance, he could see her face was drawn with exhaustion and worry. Grace Taylor had arrived in Willow Creek just 3 weeks prior, a recent widow with a 4-month-old daughter. Her husband, a cavalry lieutenant, had been killed in a skirmish with raiders while escorting a supply wagon. With no family left back east, she'd used what little money she had to travel west, following a letter from her husband that spoke of the beauty and promise of Willow Creek. The townspeople had welcomed her with typical frontier kindness offers of meals, a small room above the millinery shop, and promises of work once she was settled. But now Grace swayed on her feet as fever claimed her strength, her baby wailing against her chest. "Mrs. Taylor, you need to rest," urged Martha Wilson, the milliner who'd taken a shine to the young widow. "Emma needs to be fed," Grace protested weakly, her voice barely audible over her daughter's cries. "You can't feed her if you collapse dead in the street," Martha replied with practical bluntness. "What you need is a doctor and bed rest." "The doctor is a week away, yes, but we can send for him in Pine Ridge. Meanwhile, you need help with the baby." Martha's eyes scanned the gathered crowd, seeking someone capable of riding swiftly to fetch the doctor from the neighboring town. Her gaze landed on Vaughn, still mounted atop Thunder. "Mr. Zeller," she called out, "you've got the fastest horse in the county. Could you ride to Pine Ridge for Doc Wilkins?" Vaughn's scowl deepened. He opened his mouth to refuse when Grace Taylor lifted her face toward him. Despite her illness, her green eyes held a clarity and determination that caught him off guard. She was young, perhaps 23, with auburn hair escaping from a simple bun. There was something in her gaze that pierced through his customary armor of indifference. "I'll pay," Grace said, her voice stronger than expected. "Whatever it costs." Vaughn snorted. It was obvious the widow had little to spare. Before he could respond, Grace's knees buckled. Martha caught her before she hit the ground, but the baby slipped from her weakened grasp. With reflexes honed by years on horseback, Vaughn was off Thunder in an instant, lunging forward to catch the falling bundle. The infant landed safely in his arms, her cries momentarily silenced by the shock of transition. Time seemed to stop, as Vaughn Zeller, the most feared man in Willow Creek, found himself holding a tiny human wrapped in a pale blue blanket. The baby Emma stared up at him with wide, curious eyes, the same shade of green as her mother's. Her tiny fist escaped the blanket, reaching up to grab at his beard. "Take her!" Vaughn growled, uncomfortable with the strange feeling blooming in his chest. Yet, when he tried to hand the child to Martha, the milliner shook her head. "I need to get Mrs. Taylor to bed. Someone needs to mind the baby while I send Billy for supplies." Her eyes narrowed shrewdly. "Just hold her a minute longer, Mr. Zeller. Surely a man with your reputation isn't afraid of a little baby." The challenge in her voice struck Vaughn's pride. "I ain't afraid of nothing," he muttered, "but I don't know the first thing about babies." "Just keep her from crying while I tend to her mother," Martha instructed, already helping Grace toward the millinery shop. "And find someone to fetch the doctor from Pine Ridge." Vaughn stood in the middle of the street, a tiny infant in his arms, and a circle of curious onlookers maintaining a safe distance. The baby's eyes remained fixed on his face, her tiny features scrunched in what might have been concentration. "Well, don't just stand there gawking," he barked at the crowd. "One of you ride to Pine Ridge for the doctor." Young Tom Peterson, eager to impress, volunteered immediately. "I'll go." "Mr. Zeller?" "Then get going!" Vaughn snapped, and the boy scrambled toward the livery stable. Left with no immediate solution to his predicament, Vaughn awkwardly adjusted the baby in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, yet somehow seemed to weigh more heavily on him than any burden he'd carried. "What am I supposed to do with you?" he muttered. To his surprise, Emma gurgled, her tiny hand reaching for his face again. Something about the innocent gesture struck Vaughn with unexpected force. It had been years since anyone had reached for him with anything other than fear or caution. As the baby began to fuss, Vaughn instinctively began to rock her, a distant memory of watching his mother with his younger siblings surfacing from the depths of his mind. When Emma quieted, a strange sense of accomplishment washed over him. Martha emerged from the millinery shop, her expression grim. "Mrs. Taylor's fever is high. She needs medicine and proper care." "The boy's gone for the doctor," Vaughn replied. Martha nodded, then eyed the surprisingly peaceful baby in his arms. "Well, I'll be. She seems to like you, Mr. Zeller." Embarrassed, Vaughn shifted his weight. "What about the baby? She'll need feeding and such." "Mrs. Jenkins has a new baby. She might be able to help with feeding," Martha mused. "But someone needs to mind little Emma until her mother recovers." The expectant look Martha gave him made Vaughn's stomach sink. "No," he said firmly. "Absolutely not." "Why not? You're doing fine so far." "I'm a ranch hand, not a nursemaid." His voice rose, causing Emma to startle and begin crying again. Immediately, Vaughn lowered his tone, rocking the baby awkwardly until she settled. "See? I've got no business with a child." Martha crossed her arms. "Mrs. Taylor has no family, Mr. Zeller. The whole town will pitch in, but we all have our own responsibilities. You've got that cabin all to yourself, and from what I hear, you're between cattle drives." "This is madness," Vaughn protested, though with less conviction than before. Something about the helpless bundle in his arms made his usual arguments feel hollow. "It's just until she's well enough to care for Emma herself," Martha pressed. "A few days at most. Mrs. Jenkins can help with the feeding, and I'll show you how to change and bathe her." "Change her?" Vaughn repeated, horror dawning on his face. Martha's lips twitched with amusement. "Yes, Mr. Zeller. Babies need fresh diapers regularly." Vaughn looked down at Emma, who had fallen asleep in his arms, her tiny face peaceful. He thought of Grace Taylor's determined eyes, of the courage it must have taken to travel west with an infant after losing her husband. Something stirred in him, a sense of responsibility he couldn't easily dismiss. 3 days, he conceded gruffly, "not a day more, and you'll bring everything the baby needs to my cabin." Martha's smile spread across her face. "I knew you weren't as hard-hearted as you pretend, Mr. Zeller. Don't push it," he warned, though the usual heat was missing from his voice. "And not a word of this to anyone, you understand?" "Of course not," Martha agreed, though they both knew the news would spread through Willow Creek faster than a prairie fire. "I'll gather supplies and meet you at your cabin. Mrs. Jenkins will come by for the feeding times." As Vaughn carefully mounted Thunder, with Emma securely cradled in one arm, he wondered what madness had possessed him to agree to this arrangement. The baby sighed in her sleep, nestling against his chest, and despite himself, Vaughn felt his heart constrict. "Don't get used to this, little one," he murmured as Thunder carried them toward his cabin at a gentle walk. "This is strictly temporary." Emma's only response was to curl her tiny fingers around the edge of his vest, holding on with surprising strength. Vaughn's cabin was a simple structure, one main room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, and shelves holding the few possessions he cared to own. It was clean, if sparse, the mark of a man who preferred order, but saw little point in comfort. After carefully laying Emma on his bed, surrounding her with blankets to prevent her from rolling off, Vaughn set about building a fire. The spring evenings in Colorado could be chilly, and he reckoned a baby would need more warmth than he usually bothered with. As he worked, his mind drifted to Grace Taylor. There was something about her that had caught his attention even before the crisis. Perhaps it was the way she carried herself with dignity despite her circumstances, or the direct way she looked at people, including him. Most folks in town avoided his gaze. A soft whimper from the bed interrupted his thoughts. Emma had awakened and was beginning to fuss, her little legs kicking at the blankets. "Now what?" Vaughn muttered, approaching the bed warily. He picked her up awkwardly, holding her at arm's length as though she might explode. Emma's fussing increased, her face reddening. Remembering how he'd held her before, Vaughn brought her against his chest, supporting her head in the crook of his arm. The change in position seemed to help, but she continued to make distressed sounds. "You hungry, little one?" he asked, feeling foolish for talking to an infant. "Your mama's sick, but help's coming. You just gotta be patient." As if understanding his words, Emma quieted slightly, her green eyes fixed on his face. Vaughn found himself wondering how much of her mother was reflected in those eyes, the same determination, perhaps, the same directness. A knock at the door announced Martha's arrival. She entered carrying a basket laden with supplies, followed by Mrs. Jenkins, a kind-faced woman in her 30s with a baby of her own strapped to her chest. "How's our little guest doing?" Martha asked, setting down the basket. "Fussing," Vaughn replied. "Reckon she's hungry." Mrs. Jenkins stepped forward. "I can feed her now if you'd like." Vaughn handed Emma over with surprising reluctance. As Mrs. Jenkins settled into one of his chairs to nurse both babies, Martha began unpacking the basket. "Diapers, baby clothes, a small basin for bathing," she cataloged. "I've brought some broth for Mrs. Taylor, too. The fever's still high, but she's resting now." "She'll be all right?" Vaughn found himself asking, more concerned than he cared to admit. Martha's expression softened. "Grace Taylor is stronger than she looks. She drove a wagon all the way from Kansas after burying her husband. She'll fight through this fever." Vaughn nodded, strangely reassured. "What do I need to know about the baby?" For the next hour, Martha provided a crash course in infant care, demonstrating how to change diapers. Vaughn's face remained locked in an expression of horror throughout this lesson. How to check if Emma was too hot or cold, and how to soothe her if she cried. Mostly she needs to be held, kept clean and dry, and brought to Mrs. Jenkins for feeding every few hours, Martha concluded. "Can you manage that, Mr. Zeller?" The question carried a challenge that Vaughn couldn't ignore. "I've broken wild horses and faced down armed men," he said stiffly. "I reckon I can handle one tiny baby." Mrs. Jenkins, who had finished nursing Emma, smiled knowingly. "They're smaller than horses, Mr. Zeller, but considerably more complicated." As the women prepared to leave, Vaughn was struck by a sudden thought. "Wait," he said. "How will I know if something's wrong with her? If she gets sick?" The concern in his voice must have been apparent, for both women exchanged glances. "Babies cry when they're hungry, tired, or need changing," Martha explained. "If she feels too warm or doesn't settle after you've tried everything, send for me." When they were gone, Vaughn found himself alone with Emma once more. The baby was content after feeding, her eyes growing heavy as sleep reclaimed her. Carefully, Vaughn laid her on his bed again, using blankets to create a secure nest. "Just you and me for now, little one," he murmured. "Let's try to stay out of trouble, all right?" Emma yawned in response, her tiny pink mouth forming a perfect O before she drifted off to sleep. Vaughn found himself watching her, mesmerized by the peaceful rise and fall of her chest, the delicate curve of her cheek. It struck him suddenly that this helpless creature trusted him completely, had no choice but to trust him. The weight of that responsibility settled on him more heavily than any burden he'd carried before. "I won't let anything happen to you," he promised softly. "Not while you're in my care." The first night proved more challenging than Vaughn had anticipated. Emma woke crying every few hours, needing to be changed or soothed back to sleep. By dawn, Vaughn had abandoned all hope of rest, instead sitting in a chair by the fire with Emma cradled against his chest. "You've got quite a set of lungs for such a little thing," he grumbled, though there was no real annoyance in his voice. When Mrs. Jenkins arrived for the morning feeding, she found Vaughn pacing the cabin floor, softly humming a tune he barely remembered from childhood. Emma was asleep in his arms, her head nestled securely against his shoulder. "You look exhausted, Mr. Zeller," Mrs. Jenkins observed. "Been through worse," he replied gruffly, reluctantly transferring Emma to her arms. "How about you get some rest while I feed her? I can stay for an hour or so." Too tired to argue, Vaughn collapsed onto his bed, asleep almost before his head hit the pillow. When he woke, the sun was high, and Mrs. Jenkins had departed, leaving Emma sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle, a dresser drawer lined with blankets that Martha must have arranged, moving quietly to avoid waking the baby. Vaughn stepped outside to tend to Thunder. The horse nudged his shoulder affectionately. "Strange times, old friend," Vaughn murmured, stroking the stallion's neck. "Never thought I'd be playing nursemaid to a baby." As he worked, Vaughn found his thoughts returning to Grace Taylor. Martha had promised to keep him informed of her condition, but so far there had been no news. The doctor should have arrived from Pine Ridge by now. His concern surprised him. It had been years since he'd allowed himself to care about the welfare of another person. After the war, after losing his family, he'd found it easier to keep everyone at a distance, to wrap his heart in layers of anger and indifference. Yet, in the span of a day, two females, one, a grown woman he'd barely met. The other, an infant who couldn't even speak, had somehow breached those defenses. A cry from inside the cabin interrupted his musings. Emma was awake and demanding attention. As Vaughn hurried inside, he realized with some surprise that the sound didn't irritate him, as it might have yesterday. Instead, there was something almost comforting in being needed. "Coming, little lady," he called, his voice gentler than anyone in Willow Creek would have believed possible. The day passed in a blur of feedings, diaper changes, and brief periods of rest whenever Emma slept. By afternoon, Martha arrived with news. "The doctor's with Mrs. Taylor now," she reported. "Her fever's still high, but he's hopeful. He's given her medicine that should help." "How long until she's recovered?" Vaughn asked, bouncing Emma gently as she began to fuss. Martha watched him with barely concealed amusement. "Hard to say. Could be a few more days, maybe a week." "A week?" Vaughn's eyebrows shot up. "You said 3 days." "I said a few days at most," Martha corrected. "But these things can't be rushed. Grace needs time to regain her strength, especially if she's to care for Emma properly afterward." Vaughn wanted to protest, to remind Martha of their agreement, but Emma chose that moment to grab a fistful of his beard and tug, distracting him from his objection. "Ow, easy there, little one," he muttered, carefully disentangling her tiny fingers. To Martha, he added reluctantly, "Fine. A few more days won't kill me, I suppose." Martha's smile was knowing. "Indeed. And how are you finding parenthood, Mr. Zeller?" "I'm not her parent," Vaughn corrected quickly. "Just minding her temporarily." "Of course," Martha agreed, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "Still, you seem to be managing well. Emma looks content." Vaughn glanced down at the baby in his arms, who had settled against his chest, one ear pressed to his heart as though listening to its steady rhythm. A strange warmth spread through him. "She's an easy baby," he said, his voice gruff with emotion he didn't want to acknowledge. "Doesn't take much to keep her happy." "Some might say the same about men," Martha observed wryly. "Though you've always seemed the exception, Mr. Zeller." Before Vaughn could respond to that impertinence, Martha continued, "I've brought more supplies and some stew for your supper. Mrs. Jenkins will be by as usual for the evening feeding." After she left, Vaughn sat with Emma by the fire, contemplating Martha's words. Had he really been so difficult to please? His reputation for anger was well-deserved, he knew that much. But there had been a time, long ago, when he'd been different, when joy had come easily, and laughter had been a natural part of his days. Emma stirred against him, making small, contented sounds. Vaughn found himself speaking to her softly, words he'd held inside for years. "I wasn't always like this, you know. Before the war I had plans, a sweetheart back home. Thought I'd have a family of my own someday." He paused, memories washing over him. Then the fighting started, and everything changed. Saw things no man should see, did things I can't forget. Emma's eyes drifted open, fixing on his face with what seemed like genuine interest. "When I finally made it home, my folks had died of fever, my sweetheart had married another. Seemed like everything I'd fought for was gone." Vaughn sighed, the weight of old grief pressing down. "Easier to be angry than to hurt. Folks leave an angry man alone." The baby reached up, her tiny hand pressing against his cheek as though in comfort. Vaughn felt a lump form in his throat. "You're a good listener, Emma Taylor," he whispered. "But don't you worry about old Vaughn. You just focus on growing strong for your mama." The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Vaughn was in the middle of attempting to bathe Emma, a process that had somehow resulted in him getting wetter than the baby, when a knock sounded at the door. "It's open," he called, figuring it was Martha or Mrs. Jenkins. Instead, Sheriff Davis entered, followed by two men Vaughn recognized as hands from the Bar S ranch. The sheriff's eyebrows rose dramatically at the sight of Vaughn Zeller, terror of 3 territories, kneeling beside a basin with a naked, squirming infant. "Well, I'll be," the sheriff drawled. "Heard the rumors, but had to see for myself." Vaughn scowled, hastily wrapping Emma in a towel. "Something you need, Sheriff?" The men from Bar S were less diplomatic than the sheriff, barely containing their amusement. "Boss sent us to fetch you, Zeller," one said. "Got a herd needs moving to the north pasture. Said to tell you he's paying extra." Vaughn looked down at Emma, who was happily gumming the edge of the towel. The idea of returning to familiar work was tempting a day in the saddle instead of changing diapers and warming milk. Yet the thought of leaving Emma, so even in capable hands, caused an unexpected pang of reluctance. "Can't do it," he replied. "Got my hands full here." The ranch hands exchanged glances of disbelief. "You turning down work for babysitting?" one asked incredulously. Vaughn's eyes narrowed dangerously. "The lady's mother is sick. I gave my word I'd look after her." Something in his tone must have warned the men not to press further. The sheriff, however, seemed more intrigued than intimidated. "That's mighty generous of you, Zeller," he observed. "Mrs. Taylor's fortunate to have your help." There was no mockery in the sheriff's voice, only genuine surprise and perhaps a hint of respect. Vaughn felt oddly defensive. "Anyone would do the same," he muttered, though all 4 men in the room knew that wasn't true. After the visitors departed, Vaughn finished dressing Emma in one of the clean gowns Martha had provided. The baby seemed in good spirits, cooing and waving her arms as he struggled with the tiny buttons. "Those fellows think old Vaughn's gone soft," he told her conversationally. "Maybe they're right. Can't seem to muster a proper temper with you around." Emma responded by blowing a bubble and kicking her feet excitedly. "Is that so?" Vaughn chuckled, surprising himself. When was the last time he'd laughed? "Well, you keep that opinion to yourself, little lady. I've got a reputation to maintain." As the day progressed, Vaughn found himself settling into a routine with Emma. Between Mrs. Jenkins' visits, he discovered that the baby enjoyed being carried outside to look at thunder, and that singing in his deep baritone could soothe her almost instantly when she was fussy. By evening, Martha arrived with news that lifted Vaughn's spirits unexpectedly. "Grace's fever broke this afternoon," she reported. "She's weak, but the doctor says the worst has passed. She's been asking about Emma." "She's well enough for visitors?" Vaughn asked, trying to ignore the leap his heart gave at the thought of seeing Grace again. Martha nodded. "A short visit would do her good. She's worried about imposing on you." That evening, after Mrs. Jenkins had fed Emma and departed, Vaughn carefully bundled the baby against the cool night air. The walk to town was pleasant, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Your mama's feeling better," he told Emma, who was wide-eyed and alert in his arms. "She's been missing you something fierce, I expect." The millinery shop was quiet when he arrived, Martha led him upstairs to a small room where Grace Taylor sat propped up in bed. Despite her pallor, she looked better than when he'd last seen her. Her auburn hair was loose around her shoulders, and her green eyes brightened at the sight of her daughter. "Emma," she breathed, reaching out as Vaughn approached the bed. He carefully transferred the baby into her mother's arms, watching as Grace pressed a kiss to Emma's forehead. "Thank you, Mr. Zeller," Grace said, looking up at him with eyes that shimmered with emotion. "Martha told me how you've been caring for her. I can't express my gratitude." Vaughn felt heat rise to his face. "It's nothing, madam. The little one's been no trouble." Grace's smile suggested she didn't quite believe him. "Still, it was kind of you. I know you must have better things to do than tend to another person's child." "Not particularly," Vaughn admitted. He hesitated, then added gruffly, "I'm glad to see you're on the mend, Mrs. Taylor. Please call me Grace." She shifted Emma to her shoulder, wincing slightly at the movement. "You should rest," Vaughn said, concern evident in his voice. "I can take Emma back with me tonight. Give you time to recover your strength." Grace looked torn. "I've missed her terribly, but—" She glanced down at her trembling hands. "Perhaps one more night would be wise. If it's truly no imposition?" "None at all," Vaughn assured her, surprised to find he meant it. The thought of one more night with Emma brought comfort rather than burden. As he prepared to leave with Emma, Grace caught his hand. Her touch was light, but it sent an unexpected warmth through Vaughn's arm. "Mr. Zeller," she said softly. "Vaughn," he corrected. "Just Vaughn." "Vaughn," Grace repeated, the name sounding different on her lips. "I don't believe all the stories they tell about you." The simple statement caught him off guard. "Most of them are true enough," he replied after a moment. Grace's eyes held his. "Perhaps. But there must be more to the story. A man who cares for a stranger's baby, as you have, cannot be as fearsome as they say." Vaughn had no response to that. With a nod that he hoped conveyed what he couldn't express in words, he carefully took Emma back into his arms and departed. Walking back to his cabin under the star-strewn sky, Vaughn found himself wondering about Grace Taylor, about her life before widowhood, about what had brought her to Willow Creek of all places, about the courage it must have taken to start anew with an infant in her arms. "Your mama's quite a woman," he told Emma, who was beginning to doze against his shoulder. "Brave as they come." The thought stayed with him through the night, as he settled Emma to sleep and prepared for what would likely be their last night together. There was an ache in his chest that he didn't want to examine too closely, a sense of impending loss that made no logical sense. Emma wasn't his to lose. Yet, as he watched the sleeping infant, Vaughn realized that in just a few days, she had changed something fundamental within him. The anger that had been his constant companion for years had receded, replaced by gentler emotions he'd thought long buried: protectiveness, tenderness, even joy. "What am I going to do without you, little one?" he whispered. The question hung in the quiet cabin, unanswered. The following morning, Vaughn was surprised by a visitor just as he finished changing Emma into her cleanest gown. Dr. Wilkins, a stout man with kind eyes and a bushy mustache, knocked briskly before entering. "Mr. Zeller," he greeted. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion. Thought I'd check on the little lady before heading back to Pine Ridge." Vaughn nodded, oddly grateful for the doctor's consideration. "She seems well enough. Eating, sleeping, the usual." Dr. Wilkins approached, examining Emma with gentle efficiency. "Looks healthy indeed." "You've done a fine job, Mr. Zeller." He peered at Vaughn over his spectacles. "Not many men would have stepped up as you did." Uncomfortable with the praise, Vaughn changed the subject. "How's Mrs. Taylor?" "Recovering well. Should be able to care for the baby herself in another day or so." The doctor packed his bag. Though she mentioned hoping to find work soon, not easy for a widow with a young child. Vaughn frowned. "Work? She's barely recovered from fever." "Necessity doesn't always wait for full recovery," the doctor replied with a shrug. "She's determined not to be a burden on the town's charity any longer than necessary." After the doctor left, Vaughn sat with Emma in his arms, contemplating what he'd learned. The thought of Grace struggling to support herself and Emma while still weak from illness troubled him deeply. That afternoon, he made a decision. Bundling Emma up once more, he walked to town with purpose in his stride. Rather than heading directly to the millinery shop, however, he stopped first at the Bar S Ranch office on the edge of town. Frank Simmons, the ranch owner, looked up in surprise as Vaughn entered with a baby in his arms. "Zeller, heard you were playing nursemaid, but didn't quite believe it." "Need to talk business, Frank," Vaughn said, ignoring the remark. "That north pasture cabin, the one you've been meaning to fix up, it's still available?" Frank leaned back in his chair, intrigued. "Could be. Why?" "I want to rent it, and I want steady work, not just seasonal. Year-round employment." "This a permanent arrangement?" Frank asked, nodding toward Emma. "No," Vaughn said quickly. "But her mother needs work and a place to stay. Thought maybe you could use help with the accounts and such. I hear Mrs. Taylor's educated." Understanding dawned on Frank's face. "The widow who's been sick. Martha mentioned she taught school back east before she married." "She needs a fresh start," Vaughn said simply. "Reckon we all did at some point." Frank studied him thoughtfully. "Never figured you for the charitable sort, Zeller." "It's not charity," Vaughn replied, his voice firm. "It's the right thing to do." To his credit, Frank didn't press further. "I could use help with the books," he admitted. "Been meaning to hire someone since Mrs. Simmons passed. And that cabin needs a family in it." He nodded decisively. "Send Mrs. Taylor to see me when she's well enough. We'll work something out." With that settled, Vaughn continued to the millinery shop, where he found Grace sitting up in a chair by the window, looking much improved from the day before. Her face brightened at the sight of Emma, and Vaughn felt an unexpected flutter in his chest at her smile. "Good afternoon," Grace greeted, reaching for her daughter. "How has she been?" "Perfect," Vaughn replied, carefully transferring Emma to her mother's arms. "Dr. Wilkins stopped by this morning. Says she's as healthy as can be." Grace held Emma close, inhaling the scent of her hair. "I've missed her so much. Thank you for taking such good care of her." Vaughn shuffled his feet, suddenly nervous about his news. "Mrs. Taylor Grace, I took the liberty of speaking with Frank Simmons at the Bar S Ranch." Her eyebrows rose in question. "He's looking for someone to help with the ranch accounts. And there's a cabin available, small but sound. Needs a woman's touch, but it's a decent place." The words tumbled out faster than he intended. "He'd like you to come see him when you're feeling stronger." Grace's expression shifted from surprise to confusion. "You arranged employment for me." "Just an opportunity," Vaughn clarified quickly. "If you're interested, the cabin would give you and Emma privacy, and the work is respectable." For a moment, Vaughn feared he'd overstepped, especially when tears welled in Grace's eyes. But then she smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her face. "That's incredibly kind," she said softly. "Why would you do this for us?" Vaughn struggled to articulate feelings he barely understood himself. "Emma deserves a good start," he said finally. "And so do you." Grace studied him, her green eyes seeming to see more than he intended to reveal. "Martha told me about your reputation in town," she said carefully. "About your temper." Vaughn tensed, waiting for the judgment that usually followed such discussions. "But she also told me how gentle you've been with Emma, how you haven't raised your voice once, even when she cried through the night." Grace shifted Emma to her other arm. "People can change, can't they, Vaughn?" The question held more weight than its simple words suggested. Vaughn thought of the past few days, of the peace he'd found in caring for Emma, of the softening he felt within himself. "Maybe they can," he acknowledged quietly, "given the right reason." The look that passed between them was charged with something neither was ready to name. Grace was the first to break the silence. "I'll speak with Mr. Simmons tomorrow," she said. "And Vaughn, would you consider coming for supper once we're settled, to thank you properly for everything you've done?" "I'd like that," Vaughn replied, surprising himself with how much he meant it. Over the next 2 weeks, Grace and Emma settled into the cabin at the Bar S Ranch. True to his word, Frank Simmons employed Grace to manage the ranch accounts, allowing her to work flexible hours and bring Emma with her when necessary. Vaughn returned to his regular duties, though he found himself riding past the small cabin more often than was strictly necessary. Sometimes he caught glimpses of Grace hanging laundry or walking with Emma in her arms. Each sighting left him with a peculiar warmth he was still learning to understand. The invitation to supper came on a Friday. Vaughn arrived at the cabin with uncharacteristic nervousness, having bathed and shaved with particular care. He'd even purchased a new shirt in town blue, because Martha had mentioned once that it matched his eyes. The cabin was transformed from the dusty, neglected place it had been. Simple curtains hung at the windows, wild flowers brightened the table, and the scent of cooking filled the air. Grace welcomed him with a smile that made his pulse quicken. "You've worked wonders here," Vaughn observed, looking around appreciatively. "It didn't take much," Grace replied. "Just a woman's touch, as you said." Emma, now nearly 5 months old, was awake and alert in a cradle that Vaughn recognized as Frank's handiwork. The baby's face lit up at the sight of Vaughn, her arms reaching toward him with unmistakable recognition. "I think she remembers you," Grace said, a note of wonder in her voice. "May I?" Vaughn asked, gesturing toward the cradle. At Grace's nod, he lifted Emma into his arms, a sense of rightness settling over him as the baby nestled against his chest. "Hello, little lady," he murmured. "You've grown since I saw you last." Over supper, Grace told Vaughn about her life before coming west, her childhood in Pennsylvania, her years teaching school, meeting Lieutenant James Taylor during the war. "James always dreamed of going west," she explained. "After he died, I found his letters describing Willow Creek. It seemed fitting to fulfill his dream, even if he couldn't." "You loved him very much," Vaughn observed, surprised to find the statement didn't bring the jealousy he might have expected. "I did," Grace agreed. "But James believed in living fully. He wouldn't want Emma and me to spend our lives in mourning." Her eyes met Vaughn's. "He'd be grateful to you for helping us." "Anyone would have done the same," Vaughn insisted, though they both knew that wasn't true. "Not anyone," Grace countered gently. "It takes a special kind of man to care for a stranger's child as you did." The evening passed in comfortable conversation, with Emma occasionally joining in with happy babbling. As the hour grew late, Vaughn reluctantly prepared to leave. At the door, Grace surprised him by touching his arm. "You're welcome here any time, Vaughn. Emma misses you." The implication that perhaps Grace missed him too hung unspoken between them. "I'd like that," he replied, his voice rougher than usual. "Good night, Grace." As spring blossomed into summer, Vaughn became a regular visitor at the small cabin. He brought small gifts, a rocking chair he'd crafted himself, toys for Emma whittled from soft pine, fresh berries from the hills. Each visit lengthened until he was often staying for supper or arriving early enough to help Grace with chores. The town of Willow Creek watched this development with keen interest. The transformation in Vaughn Zeller was remarkable to those who had known him before. His legendary temper seemed to have vanished, replaced by a patience that surprised everyone, especially when it came to Emma, who had taken to greeting him with excited squeals whenever he appeared. "Never thought I'd live to see Vaughn Zeller making baby noises," Samuel remarked one evening, as Vaughn stopped by the saloon for a rare drink. "That widow and her baby have worked a miracle on you, son." Vaughn couldn't deny it. Something fundamental had shifted within him, as though caring for Emma had unlocked a part of himself he'd thought forever lost to war and grief. What he hadn't expected was the growing attachment he felt toward Grace. It went beyond gratitude or friendly concern. When she smiled at him, his heart performed acrobatics that a younger, more foolish version of himself would have recognized instantly as love. But Vaughn was cautious. Grace was still recovering from the loss of her husband. She needed a friend, not a suitor. And while she seemed to enjoy his company, he had no way of knowing if her feelings extended beyond appreciation for his help with Emma. One warm evening in late June, Vaughn arrived at the cabin to find Grace looking troubled. Emma was already asleep in her cradle, leaving the adults to talk quietly by the fire. "Is something wrong?" Vaughn asked, concern evident in his voice. Grace hesitated. "I received a letter today from James's aunt in Boston. She's offered to take Emma and me in." Vaughn felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath him. "You're leaving Willow Creek?" "I haven't decided," Grace replied, watching his face carefully. "It would be a secure future for Emma. Good schools, proper society." "And is that what you want?" Vaughn asked, struggling to keep his voice neutral. Grace looked into the fire. "When James died, I thought my life was over. Coming west was an act of desperation as much as courage." She turned to face him. "But here, I've found something I never expected." "What's that?" Vaughn's heart hammered against his ribs. "A new beginning," she said softly. "For Emma, certainly, but also for me." Vaughn swallowed hard. "Grace, I've no right to ask you to stay. Boston would offer advantages Willow Creek can't match." "Perhaps," she acknowledged. "But would it offer someone who loves my daughter as you do?" The question hung between them, loaded with meaning Vaughn barely dared to interpret. "Emma's easy to love," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes, she is." Grace's eyes held his. "And what about her mother?" The directness of the question caught Vaughn off guard. In that moment, looking at Grace's expectant face, he realized he couldn't hide his feelings. Any longer, didn't want to hide them. "Her mother," he began carefully, "is the bravest, most determined woman I've ever known. She's made me remember parts of myself I thought were gone forever." He took a deep breath. "If she were to leave, she'd take more than just Emma with her. She'd take my heart." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Then I suppose we're staying," she whispered, "because I don't think I could bear to take your heart so far away." The distance between them closed, and when Vaughn's lips met Grace's, it felt like coming home after a long, dark journey. Her arms wound around his neck as she returned his kiss with unexpected fervor. When they finally parted, both breathless, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Grace Taylor," he said, the words easier to speak than he'd imagined. "You and Emma both." "And we love you," Grace replied, her voice filled with wonder. "Emma adores you, and I—" She touched his face gently. "I never thought I'd find love again." But here you are. The summer nights grew shorter, but Vaughn's visits to the cabin grew longer, until Martha Wilson finally took it upon herself to speak plainly to him after church one Sunday. "People are talking, Mr. Zeller," she said, though her tone held more amusement than censure. "A respectable widow, a single man calling at all hours." Vaughn understood her meaning immediately. "I'll speak with Reverend Peterson this afternoon," he promised. Martha's face broke into a delighted smile. "I thought you might say that." The proposal itself was hardly romantic by conventional standards. Vaughn and Grace were walking along the creek, Emma secure in her mother's arms, when he simply stopped, took Grace's free hand, and spoke from his heart. "I never expected to find a family again," he said, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. "But that's what you and Emma have become to me. I love you both more than I thought possible." He squeezed her hand gently. "Grace Taylor, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Grace's answer was immediate. "Yes," she said, her eyes shining. "Yes, with all my heart." Emma, as if understanding the significance of the moment, let out a delighted squeal and reached for Vaughn. Laughing, he took her into his arms, holding both her and Grace close. "My girls," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "My family." They were married 2 weeks later, in a simple ceremony at the church in Willow Creek. The entire town turned out, more out of curiosity than anything else. Vaughn Zeller, once feared for his unpredictable temper, stood before the altar with a gentle smile, watching as Grace walked toward him with Emma in her arms. As they spoke their vows, Emma reached out and grabbed Vaughn's finger, holding tight as though adding her own promise to theirs. The congregation laughed, but to Vaughn it seemed perfectly fitting. They were a family now, bound by love rather than blood. The celebration afterward at the Bar S Ranch was lively and joyful. Frank Simmons, beaming with satisfaction at his role in bringing the couple together, announced his wedding gift, the deed to the small cabin and the surrounding acre of land. "Every family needs roots," he declared, handing the papers to a stunned Vaughn. "You've earned yours, son." As the evening wore on, Samuel the bartender approached Vaughn with a wry smile. "Remember that day you nearly shot a man for suggesting you cheated at cards?" he asked. Vaughn winced at the memory. "Not my finest moment. Who'd have thought that same man would be dancing at his wedding with a baby in his arms a few months later?" Samuel shook his head in wonder. "It's a fine thing to see, Vaughn. A mighty fine thing." Later that night, after the guests had departed and Emma was asleep in her cradle, Vaughn and Grace stood together on the porch of what was now truly their home, looking up at the star-strewn sky. "Happy?" Grace asked, leaning into his embrace. Vaughn tightened his arms around her. More than I ever thought possible, he admitted. You've given me a second chance at life, Grace. You and Emma both. And you've given us a home, she replied softly. Not just a place to live, but a place to belong. As they stood together in the quiet night, Vaughn reflected on the strange, winding path that had led him here. From a war-hardened man feared for his temper to a husband and father transformed by the simple act of holding a baby. You know, he mused, pressing a kiss to Grace's temple. When Martha first asked me to hold Emma that day, I thought it was the worst idea I'd ever heard. Grace laughed softly. And now I think it was the moment everything in my life finally started making sense. He turned her in his arms to face him. Thank you for trusting me with her. With both of you. It was Emma who knew first, Grace said, her eyes twinkling. She saw the good in you before anyone else did. Smart girl, Vaughn agreed. Takes after her mother. Their kiss was gentle, filled with promise and the certainty of days to come, days they would face together as a family. Autumn arrived in a blaze of color, and with it came changes to the small cabin. Vaughn added a second bedroom, carefully crafting furniture with his own hands for the growing family. Emma, now crawling and beginning to pull herself up on furniture, explored her expanded world with delighted curiosity. The town of Willow Creek gradually adjusted to the new Vaughn Zeller, still capable of stern looks when necessary, but now more likely to be seen with a baby on his shoulders than a gun on his hip. When he occasionally lost his temper, it was in defense of his family or in response to genuine injustice, never the unpredictable rage of before. Grace thrived in her role at the Bar S Ranch, her keen mind for figures earning her the respect of everyone from Frank Simmons to the rough cowboys who initially doubted a woman's place in ranch business. When she announced that she was expecting a child in the spring, the entire ranch celebrated as though it were their own good fortune. Another baby, Vaughn marveled one evening, his hand resting gently on Grace's still flat stomach. Emma will have a brother or sister. Are you happy about it? Grace asked, though his radiant expression had already answered her question. Happier than I can say, he replied, drawing her close. I never thought I'd have one child to love, let alone two. Emma, playing on a quilt nearby, babbled happily as though adding her approval. At 10 months old, she had developed a distinctly independent personality, determined like her mother, with flashes of her stepfather's intensity. Her first word had been Papa, directed unmistakably at Vaughn, who had promptly excused himself to the barn to hide the tears that sprang to his eyes. As winter settled over Willow Creek, bringing snow that transformed the landscape into a glittering wonderland, the cabin was a haven of warmth and happiness. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire with Emma sleeping contentedly in her father's arms, Grace presented Vaughn with a small package. What's this? He asked, carefully shifting Emma to accept the gift. Open it, Grace urged, her eyes bright with anticipation. Inside was a silver frame, and within it, a document that Vaughn had to read several times before its significance registered. It was an adoption certificate, officially recognizing Vaughn Zeller as Emma's father in the eyes of the law. Grace, he whispered, his voice failing him. How did you arrange this? Judge Patterson owed me a favor, she explained. He agreed to process the paperwork without the usual waiting period. She touched his hand. Emma has been yours in heart since that first day you held her. Now she's yours in name as well. Vaughn looked down at the sleeping child in his arms, his daughter, legally and completely his. Best Christmas gift I could imagine, he managed, his voice rough with emotion. There's one more, Grace said, taking his hand and placing it on her growing belly. I felt the baby move today for the first time. As if in confirmation, Vaughn felt a faint flutter beneath his palm. The miracle of it struck him speechless. This was his family, Grace, Emma, and now this new life they had created together. From a man who had once had nothing, who had wrapped his wounded heart in layers of anger to protect it from further pain, he had become rich beyond measure in the things that truly mattered. I love you, he told Grace, the words inadequate to express the depth of his feeling. And I love you, she replied, leaning against him. Now and always. Emma stirred briefly in her sleep, her tiny hand curling around her father's finger, even in slumber, holding on with the same determination she'd shown that first day when Martha Wilson had challenged a temperamental cowboy to hold a baby. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing Willow Creek in pristine white. But inside the cabin, beside a crackling fire, Vaughn Zeller held his world in his arms and knew, with absolute certainty, that his days of aimless anger were behind him. The future stretched ahead, bright with promise and the laughter of children, a future he would build with Grace, one day at a time, surrounded by the love he had once believed was lost to him forever. When spring returned to the Colorado foothills, bringing wildflowers and birdsong back to Willow Creek, Grace gave birth to a son. They named him James Vaughn Zeller, honoring both the man who had first brought Grace west and the man who had given her a reason to stay. Emma, now walking confidently and chattering in increasingly complex sentences, approached her baby brother with solemn curiosity. "My baby," she declared, patting his head with gentle hands that Vaughn had taught her to use with thunder. "Yes, sweet girl," Grace agreed, her face glowing with happiness despite her exhaustion. "Your baby brother, to love and help protect." Vaughn, watching his family from the doorway, felt his heart expand with a joy so profound it almost hurt. "She'll be a fine big sister," he observed, moving to sit beside Grace on the bed. "She learned from the best," Grace replied, reaching for his hand. "You've been protecting both of us from the start." As Emma climbed into his lap to get a better view of her brother, Vaughn reflected on the journey that had brought them here. It had begun with anger, a gunshot, a broken bottle, harsh words spat into the dust of Willow Creek's main street, and it had been transformed by love, sparked in the moment a desperate widow had asked him to hold her baby. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked, noting his thoughtful expression. Vaughn smiled, gathering his daughter close with one arm while his other hand rested protectively on his son's tiny form. "Just that some things are worth changing for," he said simply. Emma looked up at him with eyes that mirrored her mother's eyes that had seen through his gruff exterior from the very beginning. "Papa," she said confidently, patting his cheek. "My papa." And in those two small words, Vaughn Zeller, once known throughout 3 territories for his fearsome temper, now known in Willow Creek as a devoted husband and father, found the perfect summation of the miracle his life had become.